Hello, my name is Kian McInnis. I am an undergraduate in my fourth year studying for a bachelor's in history and creative writing. This is my presentation of the inherent naivete in power. I hope you find it interesting. The research that I have conducted revolves around the mythos of exploration that was put to the test during the late 18th century. As we all are objectively ignorant in our subjective experience, I wanted to investigate the reality of explorers during this unprecedented century of discovery and innovation. Regardless of the moral implications in the actions of the ship's crew, there are operating rationalizations that steer the power wielded by imperialism and its trail of history to an inevitability or fate. The complexity and nuance of influence throughout history are only as comprehensive as the potential information one may glean from research. History as a field stands to preserve moments of investigative opportunity, so that humanity's understanding of itself may swell. In moments of first contact, there are beautiful instances of separate, but truthful, humanities compromising their power so that conflicting ideologies may perpetuate. As the Western world began its centuries-long process of global colonization, many languages, religions, and cultures interacted for the first time in human history. In order to walk down a road of subjectively rational imperialism, even if subconsciously, these global powers needed to believe that they ontologically understood the peoples and regions in relation to themselves, if they truly were intending on prescribing generations of their own ilk to live far from their genetically historic homes. Prefacing that understanding is the research and information needed to achieve some semblance of functional national competency in navigation, warfare, theology, diplomacy, international relations, and cultural assimilation. Looking specifically at the English as they became a dominant seafaring power over the course of several centuries of classical colonization and the documents they generated during this age of exploration, readers are made keen on the values and beliefs within their history even whilst they are not explicitly invoked. The foundational ideologies coursing through England and largely Western Europe during this time are widely discussed throughout historical and academic communities. Looking to the ideas of classical liberal individualism, English Protestantism, and the narratives of white exceptionalism championed by European tycoons, made ascendant by the Industrial Revolution, teach the reader not historical bias, but historical or civilizational modus operandi. An explorer frames their understanding of the world based on the safety and comfort offered to them by their home. As James Cook and Joseph Banks raced the Western world into the unknown, they carried with them damning intentions of superiority and desire. The multitude of indigenous communities and ecosystems confronting Cook and his crew are arguably wielding their willpower towards achieving that same security offered by the memory of home, all the while being severely made aware of the power imbalance previously clouded in an ignorance without blame, but an act of ignorance nonetheless. Defining exploration in this, the age of exploration, is a vital component in understanding the grounds on which I am conducting this research. Exploration, in the simplest of terms, is a confrontation of the familiar with the unfamiliar, home versus away. Whether this understanding is applied to the Aboriginal communities in their own confrontation with European powers or vice versa is dependent on the supporting evidence regarding the narrative being formed. Restricting this research to the ideologies held by the crew of the HMS Bark Endeavour makes this investigation a case study on the aristocratic, genteel, scientific, and militaristic perspectives of those involved. Those who could afford the cost of travel, room, and board on board of a research vessel were part of an exclusive societal group, insular in an educational and socio-economic sense, where the popular modes of thought being disseminated throughout the hierarchical structure had to be adhered to for a sense of communal belonging and duty. When covering individual perspectives, Hannah Arendt writes on a historicity in how human essence, the essence of who somebody is, can come into being only when life departs, leaving behind nothing but a story. A majority of the information gathered has been compiled through varied English sources that were preserved from the 18th and 19th centuries and focus on the subjective experiences of the explorers themselves. The Aboriginal people of Australia, on the other hand, remained an oral tradition through the extensive process of their colonization, which ultimately rendered their perspective largely a shared one. Both of the inceptions rely on sources on both ends of the spectrum. On the part of the English, there are individual accounts discussing discoveries during the twilight of the 18th century. On part of the Aboriginals and natives, there are cooperatively sustained stories that encapsulate the scope of their shared experience. Understanding the language being used during the age of exploration helps historians understand the connections between ideas being discussed and the actions taken following that discourse. Another way to look at this connection between vocabulary and reality is through the thought experiment. If a tree were to fall in the forest and no one was around to hear it, would it have made a sound? Are Englishmen capable of straying from the reality that has been projected in front of them by their culture and meaning? Fairly frequent descriptions of oceanic contact between English explorers and the varied indigenous peoples of the Pacific are filtered through an Anglo-centric definition of communal identity. Prior to documenting the entirety of the globe for militaristic, religious, and scientific reasons, there were already great mythologies and legends about what could be found beyond the horizon. After probing the eastern coast of North America and being met with astonishingly new animals, geography, and peoples never before seen by the Western world, the European minds filled with lust for this knowledge and thrust upon themselves a divinely inspired mission to bring civilization to the untouched parts of the world. Initially, they began to develop ideas based on the venerated classical texts as to what could be found in these distant corners. Dating back to antiquity is a reference regarding the Earth in an attempt to reason polar opposites on a sphere. The word and meaning antipodal was adopted by the European intelligentsia as technological advancements were made in navigation and industry. Antipodal represents the diametric opposite of a center. For the tails of a coin, the antipodal becomes heads, and for the English Empire, the antipodal becomes terra incognita, or Australis. Cartographers and explorers theorized that due to the northern Eurasian landmass being as large as it was, there would logically be a balancing landmass in the southern hemisphere of equal measure. Through the legitimacy of exploration, the fringe nature of an antipodal landmass returned with rationale and patrons. The realm of English imagination moved from the plausibility of most anything existing in their known world to the possibility of anything existing in the southern hemisphere. The presentation of those creatures, people, and societies lying beyond the European scientific catalogs became fuel to the fires of literary and colonial imagination. In more ways than one, an idea of a literal global South became the perfect scapegoat for any fanatical, lavish, or prospective claims. Although it may be an unwarranted insight into the whims of the English Empire at this time, there are excellent primary sources pointing towards a powerful acknowledgement of these possibilities of new landmasses presented to an empire. James Cook was originally given a set of instructions before he embarked on his first voyage. These papers outlined the purpose of his mission in the Pacific Ocean, as he was expected to travel to Tahiti and to track the transient orbit of Venus. Enclosed in these documents was another letter with specific instructions that it only be opened by Captain Cook himself, following the completion of this initial research mission. Spoiler alert, this astronomy research went off without a hitch, and upon Cook opening this letter, he was met with a secret instruction for when they were to encounter indigenous communities on their journey to possibly discover Terra Australis. An excerpt from this writing reads, "You are also with the consent of the natives to take possession of convenient situation in the country in the name of the King of Britain, or, if you find the country uninhabited, take possession for His Majesty by setting up proper marks and inscriptions, as first discoverers and possessors." This writing, proofed by the English crown, alludes not merely to the imperial greed corrupting the Western world at the time, also to the power and allure of this mythological narrative and that dominated perceptions of social identity during the age of exploration. Just in the same manner that these powerful societal forces convincingly and justifiably persuaded Englishmen to risk their lives in pursuit of something divinely greater than themselves, their naivete in the use of unknown power allowed indigenous populations to be sorted into their prefabricated hierarchical structure without consent or representation. Contemporarily, this is still where the conflict lies between the native Australians and the now generationally embedded persons of European descent. As previously mentioned, human essence, the essence of who somebody is, can come into being only when life departs, leaving behind nothing but a story. The idea of an Australian before Australia is extremely difficult to conjure, based on the inability to voice their story. Through two distinct concepts of reality clashing between colonizer and the colonized, a death occurred, and therefore preventing them from being made immortal through this process.